Today we are going to go over every single Ranger Masterwork / Legendary ability and component. All of the exclusive stuff that a Ranger can use, the perks, the abilities, whilst loosely going over whether they're good or not, in 30 seconds or less for each of them. Whilst we're talking about what they do, we'll be showing what they do in the background, as at this point I have everything for the Ranger barring one component, which apparently doesn't work, so good timing really. My name is Ryan Central. I do want to make more videos like this, and less big update kind of news videos. I want to get nitty gritty with the gameplay of Anthem. So if this interests you, and you want to see more, then do subscribe, like this video if you want to see more videos like this, and comment below, out of the Interceptor, Storm and Colossus, what Javelin would you like me to cover in this fashion too? In the title I did say looking at all of the legendary / masterwork abilities and components. Whilst we will be looking specifically at the masterworks, I do want to highlight that for the most part, legendaries just have increased stats. The perks on these masterwork abilities tend to stay the same. For example, I have a masterwork and a legendary version of Shadowclaw, which is for the Interceptor, it's the Wraith Strike, but as you can see as I'm comparing them, the stats instantly regaining charges on a small kill streak remain the same. The inscriptions are of course different as they are with different abilities, but the only real comparable difference between the two is that the legendary version just does more damage. So the perks tend to stay the same. So before you guys go, oh, these aren't legendary, the perks will be exactly the same from what I understand, unless Bioware changed stuff. And yes, I know, it sucks. Legendaries need to be more exciting, but that is a topic for another day. We will start with a grenade slot first, and we will go over the primers, then the detonators, and then the normal abilities. If you don't know what they are, look it up. We're not going over that today. We start with Cold-Blooded, which is the Masterwork / Legendary version of the Ice Grenade, which of course freezes targets when you hit them. The Masterwork perk on this item is that applying an ice effect increases melee damage by 135% for 10 seconds. Just to be clear, that doesn't necessarily mean that the target needs to be frozen completely for this to proc, but you do need to use this ability to apply the ice effect. Doing it with other abilities or weapons won't work, and it won't proc this perk in particular. The Siegebreaker sniper rifle that freezes targets as you shoot them, that will not activate this perk. But these kind of perks for the Ranger are par for the course for future things. There's a lot of increases melee damage does this. Ice Grenade in itself is really strong, but this perk doesn't complement the Ranger at all unless you're going for a specific Ranger melee build, which from my testing is fun, it's kooky, it's a bit dumb, but for GM1+, I would not recommend this at all, unless they completely fix how melee builds work for the Ranger. I know that was quite a long explanation for the first ability, but this kind of applies for all of the other melee perks on Masterwork gear for the Ranger, so I don't need to repeat myself then. Next up we have Explosive Blaze, which is the Inferno Grenade, which sets targets on fire. The perk for this one in particular is after applying a fire effect to 2 enemies, it detonates a fire explosion. A bit weird considering that Inferno Grenade is a primer. I don't think it detonates a combo mind, just a smaller fire explosion, very similar to Divine Vengeance, the weapon that does a similar thing. Unlike the weapon though, I found that the fire explosion damage isn't an awful lot. Inferno Grenade setting fire to targets is a really good primer though, so if you have a really strong assault detonator, combining these together is quite good. And bearing in mind that for the grenade slot there's only 2 primers, the Ice Grenade and the Inferno Grenade. The Inferno Grenade is a lot better in this case because of all of the stuff I said about the melee build. So if you find yourself wanting a semi-decent priming ability to run on a Ranger, this is your only choice for the grenade slot, to be honest. Going over the detonating abilities now, we have Last Argument and the Gambit. We'll go over the Gambit first, which is the Sticky Grenade, and hitting an enemy with this grenade detonates an ice explosion. I like this one because it specifies you don't need to detonate a combo, you don't need to defeat an enemy, all you need to do is hit an enemy with this sticky grenade and it will detonate an ice explosion. So it is just a little extra damage that you can add on top. Much like Explosive Blaze, the explosion damage isn't an awful lot, and I ran the Gambit for quite some time before I replaced it. The Sticky Grenade is a really good detonating ability in itself. It locks onto targets, and it's a lot easier to land your shots with this grenade in comparison to a frag grenade, ice grenade, a fire grenade, where for the most part I feel I just miss those shots because the target's moving or you're moving. It can be really easy to waste your grenade ability. And the cooldown on this grenade slot is quite long in comparison, so you can easily waste a lot of the grenades that we've gone over already, but the Gambit is a very consistent one that you can use. So this one is pretty good for detonating. However, the frag grenade version, Last Argument, is also pretty good. The perk for that ability is that hitting enemies adds 700% ultimate charge. To give you some context on how much 700% ultimate charge is, you've seen it on screen. It's maybe not as much as you were hoping for, but it's still a good chunk. And all you need to do is hit them with it. I found myself moving over to Last Argument from the Gambit. I feel like overall the frag grenade does a lot more damage. I'm pretty sure that the inscriptions were a lot better for me too. And I felt that having my ultimate more often was a good thing to have. Of course, the Ranger's ultimate isn't working as intended at the moment. At least at the time of recording, it doesn't detonate when apparently it should. But I do think that once those changes go through to the ult, Last Argument is definitely the one to go for. Farming your ultimate and using it as much as possible isn't a bad way to spend your time as the Ranger. And I find that this ability complements builds more than the Gambit, which is okay, but I still think that the Last Argument is the better detonator here. Best primer is Explosive Blaze, because Cold-Blooded is kinda trash. But then we go over the only normal ability in this slot, the Grand Opening, which is the Masterwork legendary version of the Seeking Grenade. Defeating an enemy from above grants 85% increased weapon damage for 20 seconds. Really good if you have a really strong weapon that you want to run, such as a sniper rifle, but it requires two things from you: to be able to kill an enemy, as in completely defeat them with your Seeking Grenades, but also to be above them hovering. Which overall, I just wouldn't recommend this because it requires you to do too many things when you have certain components or other abilities that can give you just as much weapon damage without having to mess around with finishing a target with this ability whilst hovering in the air. Turns into rubbing your tummy and patting your head, and it's just not really worth it because of that. Too many hoops to jump through. Not to mention it's neither a primer nor a detonator. I just don't think it brings enough to the table. Let's move on to the Assault Launcher slot for the Ranger. Again, we'll start with a primer. There's only one for this slot, which is Tactical Onslaught. It's the legendary Masterwork version of the Venom Dart, and it's a bit of a boring perk to be honest. It permanently gives you another charge. It actually technically gives you 2, and you had 2 already, so it gives you 4 at least. There is a chance that inscriptions could give you another 2, which makes it even better. But I really like the Venom Dart. I used to use it a lot before I got this Masterwork version as I was gearing up the Ranger with epic stuff. I found that the Venom Dart sticky grenade combo was really good. It had a really low cooldown. Of course, your combo interaction as the Ranger is that you do more critical damage, and you always tend to have a charge of Venom Dart even without this perk. So it means that you could spam this to prime targets for your friends to kill, and it does like home in on targets. So there's not really a chance of missing unless your aim is completely off. Going over the other 2 detonators, we have Recurring Vengeance, which is the Seeking Missile. After defeating an enemy, regain 100% charge, can occur once every 7.5 seconds. So when you kill an enemy with your Seeking Missile, you instantly get another charge of it. But it can't happen all of the time, there is a bit of a cooldown on this proccing. Like I went over, your combo interaction is that you do more damage, so the chance of you killing people, especially just normal adds with a Seeking Missile, is quite common, so I do imagine that you would see this one proccing quite often. The damage on the Seeking Missile is good, of course it seeks onto the target again, so it's very hard to miss this, unless your aim is, again, pretty awful. So this certainly isn't a bad one. If you're wanting a detonator in this slot, I do think that this is the best one, because the other detonator in the Assault Gear slot is Avenger's Boon, which is the Masterwork Pulse Blast. Hitting an enemy increases melee damage by 100% for 20 seconds. That increases your damage by quite a bit, and running this with Cold-Blooded means that you are increasing your melee damage by 200% or something if you manage to proc both of these. However, again, I find the melee ability for the Ranger too clunky. If they made it a little bit more fluid, like the Interceptor for example, I can see this one being fairly strong. But because of this, if you're not running a melee build, which you honestly shouldn't be if you're going for high tier difficulties, then Seeking Missile really is your only shot here. In the Assault slot, there are 2 normal abilities that neither prime nor detonate. We have Argo's Mace, which is a blast missile, which need I remind you, isn't a detonator. Weirdly enough, it should be, but it isn't. Which detonates an electric explosion when defeating an enemy. This is good if you have a stack of enemies that you want to AoE down, but because it only works when you defeat an enemy, it just doesn't feel all that powerful. The electric explosion in itself, again, isn't that great. So I would definitely recommend missing Argo's Mace. The blast missile doesn't really lock onto a target either, so it is very easy to miss with this ability. So honestly, one of the worst ones that you can run in this slot. And then we have Ember's Lance, which is the Spark Beam. Detonates an explosion on a small hit streak, which is free. You can see it on screen how much damage that these fire explosions do in comparison, and it's just a really good ability to be able to mow people down. It's a normal ability, so it doesn't detonate, which is unfortunate, but if you're looking for a normal ability to run in this slot, then Spark Beam Ember's Lance here is pretty good. I would certainly consider it a lot more. And it's so satisfying to use. Like, you just melt people, it's amazing. But they are all of the abilities that the Ranger has, all of the Masterwork perks. Some are a lot better than others, but none necessarily stand out to be, oh my god, that's actually really crazy. But now we move on to the components, which, to be honest, is just more of the same. We start with Airborne Advantage. Its normal perk is that it increases impact damage by 50%, whilst decreasing blast damage by 20%. It's important that we note that because there is another one that does vice versa as we go along. But hovering increases all resistance by 10%. That's it. It's really dull, isn't it, really? So certainly not one that you're going to be jumping for joy if you get. If you find yourself dying a lot, then this might be good, but I would certainly not recommend it. Especially if you're running blast grenades, because it decreases the damage that it does. If you're running a lot of impact damage, then certainly just run it for the base stat, not its Masterwork perk, because it's really dull. We move on to Combined Arms, which normally increases your grenade damage by 5%, but defeating an enemy with your E gear ability increases your Q gear damage by 60% for 5 seconds. This might be good if you're defeating an enemy with a detonator, with your Q ability being, let's say, Explosive Blaze, igniting the target, doing explosive damage. It's a bit awkward because you have to defeat an enemy with either a detonator or primer, so the synergy isn't really there. Unless you're running 2 detonators and you're trying to just blow everything up. Or melted people with Ember's Lance. In that case, I could definitely see Combined Arms working here. Defensive Bulwark. Its main perk is that it increases all weapon damage by 25%, which is pretty good, but its unique Masterwork perk that it has is that when you're on low health, it increases your gun damage by 25% for 10 seconds. If you have a really strong weapon, this is good. If you find yourself on low health all the time, it's pretty good. But even then, just increasing all your weapon damage by 25%, it's a secondary component, complements what you're trying to do maybe, but isn't going to define your playstyle. We now have Elemental Ops, which increases fire damage, maximum heat capacity, and fire resistance by 20%. Its unique perk is that it increases elemental effects applied to enemies by 20%. I would definitely recommend having this one at all times, especially if you're running the Inferno Grenade, any blast damage, your melee of course, the damage gets increased there. It affects your weapons. This is just really good for builds and synergy. It's not necessarily something that you would build your Javelin around, but it can complement elemental builds of course. Which in comparison to some of the other components is a damn sight stronger. General's Favour. This increases your assault launcher recharge by 35%, which is a pretty good basic stat, but the main perk that it has is defeating an enemy with your melee increases Q damage by 50% for 10 seconds. How often do you defeat somebody with your melee as the Ranger though is the question, and considering that your melee isn't a detonator, it's a primer, it kinda has things going the wrong way again. There's not a solid rotation here to run. Could be good if you are running a melee build, like it strings together quite nicely, but I wouldn't say that I'm a huge fan of this one. Tactical Advantage increases your engine heat threshold by 35%, meaning that you can hover more, but its unique Masterwork perk is that weak point hits lower thruster heat buildup by 10% for 5 seconds. So if you hit headshots or weak points of bosses, you can hover for a little bit longer, but this only happens every 5 seconds. So again, not really a great one here to go over. But if you are running a build with Avenging Herald, for example, where you want to be hovering in the air to do more damage, you'd certainly want to add this component to your slot. Tip of the Spear increases combo damage by 50%, that in itself makes it really strong, but performing a combo also restores 40% armor to nearby allies. I saw a Reddit clip before of this perk actually reviving somebody out of their down state, so I tried it myself and it does work. The issue is that you need to be literally standing on them. The range of this component is just not enough, but if they buff that, then man, yes. So you don't need me to tell you how strong this is. Not only is it strong, but it's also pretty exciting. I hope it's Bioware flirting with the idea of bringing more healing components into the game, but I really like this one. When your back's against the wall, you're surrounded by enemies, all of your team are down, you as the Ranger can bring them all back with just a well-placed combo. Not to mention that this increases your combo damage by 50%, but if you are running a combo-focused build, which is a Ranger for the most part, you should be, this is great at just topping up the health of your allies around you, and also rezzing them properly. Next we have Vanguard's Badge. increasing melee damage by 30% and electric effects by 30% of base. Even if you don't intend to melee a lot, if you're running electric based abilities like the Thunderbolt of your Venia weapon, this could certainly just add to that. But performing a melee kill restores 20% shields. If you're running that melee build, it's great. If not, I don't really see this being used anywhere. But I have the legendary version of this. Yippee. Victor's Resolve increases your blast damage by 50% whilst lowering impact damage by 20%. So this goes against Airborne Advantage. They contradict one another, so you definitely don't want to be running these perks together. But the Masterwork perk on Victor's Resolve is performing a small multi-kill of 3 instantly restores 25% of maximum armor. This is certainly a lot better than Airborne Advantage, which, as I remind you, increases your resistance while you're hovering. So if I had to pick between the two, I'd go for Victor's Resolve, especially if you're running blast damage abilities like grenades. And you want those big explosions. But the actual Masterwork unique perk is okay, it's alright, And finally, we go over the Masterwork perk of Badge of Devastation, which increases your assault launcher gear slot damage by 5%. But the Masterwork perk is very exciting. Performing a large hit streak of 10 will instantly add 1 ultimate charge. This is the one component that I don't have right now, but even if it did, apparently at this time of recording, it doesn't work anyway. But the main thing that I'd want to test and want to find out is that if it counts if you get the large hit streak with your ultimate. Of course, your ultimate hits multiple targets, so maybe you could just have that on farm. Hit streaks are kind of awkward to get within Anthem, so I don't see this Masterwork perk proccing a lot of the time. But like I said, if you're running something like Last Argument, which increases your ultimate charge when you hit an enemy with it, you could be getting your ultimate quite a bit. And this is the only Masterwork perk out of all of the Ranger stuff that's actually quite exciting and sounds a little bit OP. But now that we've gone over them, you can certainly see why so many Ranger players are quite disappointed with what they have available to them. The Interceptor, Storm and Colossus have various different builds and ways that you can make your character work. For the Ranger, it seems that you could just increase your damage a little bit, maybe even make a hover build, or you have to go towards this really awkward melee build, which I have tried and made and wanted to make a build and a video on it, but it just doesn't work. It's not as fun as you'd expect it to be, just because the Ranger's melee attack is so clunky and slow, just makes it not fun. Really, I don't think so. Those are all of the Masterwork abilities and components that the Ranger has available to them. If I was to rate them, how would I rate them? Well, so many of the components would end up in the F tier. But for the grenade slot, for a priming ability, I would go for Explosive Blaze. For a detonated ability, both Last Argument and the Gambit are pretty good, so it's personal preference. Grand Opening is a normal ability I just wouldn't use. Detonators for the assault launcher, there's only one, Tactical Onslaught, which is pretty good with the Venom Darts. Detonators have to be Recurring Vengeance, Avenger's Boon, and all of the other melee abilities I just wouldn't touch. And for the normal abilities, I really like Ember's Lance. It's a lot of fun, it's really satisfying to use. So if you don't care about running a combo build, use Ember's Lance. It's pretty tough. As for components, Badge of Devastation, giving you your ultimate with a large hit streak of 10 is pretty exciting when it works, I assume. Tip of the Spear is amazing utility for the Ranger. Hopefully this inspires Bioware to make some more healing support components for the Ranger and other javelins, of course. Elemental Ops, increasing your elemental effects applied. Solid pickup too. But there's so many of these that are terrible. Hovering increases all resistance by 10%. It's good, but it's, resident sleeper. Weak point hits lower thruster heat speed. Melee kills restoring armor. Gun damage on low health. More than half of these components for the Ranger are just super boring. So it doesn't really spice up your playstyle at all, which I was hoping for the Ranger. He has a very vanilla playstyle to begin with, so I was hoping that the Masterwork perks in themselves would spice things up, but that just really isn't the case. Some of the melee stuff is cool, but it just doesn't work in principle. I hope you enjoyed this video breakdown, and like I said at the start of this video, let me know out of the Interceptor, Storm and Colossus, which legendary abilities and components you would like me to cover next time. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, take care, and I'll see you soon.